Hello. I'm going to wait a couple minutes, just a couple seconds to make sure everybody gets on. I'd like to welcome everyone to 2022 Guelph Organic Conference. My name is Carolyn Young, and it is my honor and pleasure as the Executive Director of the Organic Council of Ontario to be introducing this year's virtual trade show and conference. At a time when we are facing unprecedented concerns about our health and the health of the planet, now more than ever, it is critical that we, as an organic movement, broaden our conversation about organic standards, beyond organic standards, although they are a big part, to include how we are contributing solutions to our generation's biggest challenges. It is for that reason that this year's conference theme is Organic Climate Solutions. And we mean that in the biggest, broadest sense of the word organic, where we came from and where we're going. This theme is part of a broader campaign that the Organic Council of Ontario is promoting, focused on the environmental and economic impacts of organic and regenerative practices. We want to celebrate the diversity of organic solutions, as well as the diversity of solutions providers, the farmers, eaters, and industry members who are choosing every day to be part of the solution, even when it is hard. Thanks to all of you for making that choice. And thank you to the Guelph Organic Conference for being a leader for decades in the Guelph organic movement. You, the Guelph Organic Conference, Tomas Nemo, and the board of the Guelph Organic Conference have brought us together for years, and we look forward to this happening in person in years to come. For those of you who don't know OCO, the Organic Council of Ontario, please do check us out and consider joining as a supporting member. Joining our organization supports our vision for a thriving local organic food sector, and it strengthens our voice and builds our capacity to make a difference. Without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Stuart Oak, the program manager at the Organic Council of Ontario, and to Brent Preston, our keynote speaker, to kick off this year's conference. Thanks so much.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Carolyn, for that introduction and welcome. As stated, my name is Stuart Oak. I am the program manager at the Organic Council of Ontario, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first session of the Guelph Organic Conference this year, our keynote session entitled Organic Climate Solutions with Brent Preston. Thank you for attending today. We would like to start off by acknowledging that the sacred land where the Organic Council of Ontario resides, as well as the home of the Guelph Organic Conference, is situated upon the traditional territories of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabeg, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we would ask that you take a moment to reflect on where you are situated and the history of the lands that you now occupy. We do encourage you to learn the history of that land you are in relationship with by visiting whose land and nativeland.ca, two links which can help that work, and we are sharing them both in the chat right now. In terms of participating in today's Zoom webinar format, I know that many of you are familiar with how this works, but for those of you that are not, we would invite everyone to introduce themselves in the chat located on the right-hand side of your webpage window. There will be a time to ask speaker questions after the presentation today, and there are two ways to ask those questions. One, you can write down your questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of the presentation screen, and you can add your question there throughout the presentations, and then our question takers will help facilitate that following the question period. And the second way to ask a question is to use the raise hand button to indicate that you would like to ask your question during the live Q&A portion of the session, and you'll be asked to unmute when your turn comes, and then you can ask your question out loud for the whole group, as well as introduce yourself. And finally, we are so fortunate to have our presenter share their knowledge and experience with us today, and acknowledge that we are a community of people who have joined the session, and do ask that you communicate respectfully with all the session participants today, both in the chat and otherwise. Some info about the Organic Council of Ontario. OCO is the voice for organics in Ontario. It's a membership-based nonprofit association that represents Ontario's organic sector. OCO is the only trade association working and advocating on behalf of the entire organic industry from field to plate. For updates on organic agricultural news, resources, funding opportunities, green jobs, and more, you can sign up for our e-news, which is on our website. The link is in the chat. This year's conference theme, as Carolyn noted, was inspired by OCO's Organic Climate Solutions campaign, which we are currently in. Through this campaign, funded by the Government of Canada's Climate Action and Awareness Fund, we are trying to raise awareness of the environmental and economic benefits of organic and regenerative farming practices and the resources available to support farmers in taking up those practices. You can use the link also in the chat to explore the Organic Climate Solutions webpage. I'd also like to take a moment to thank an important organizer in the history of the Guelph Organic Conference. I'd like to thank Thomas Nemo for his 40+ years of commitment to the organic sector and his long-standing work on the Guelph Organic Conference, which has been an important meeting place for the sector for many, many years. And moving on to a special thanks to all of our sponsors this year. The Guelph Organic Conference would not be possible without the support of the sponsors that you see. Thank you all to our seed level sponsors, and thank you to the grow level sponsors, Yorkshire Valley Farms, and EcoCert, and our flourish level sponsors, Fennings Organic Farm, ProCert Organic Systems, Canadian Organic Growers, and the Prairie Organic Development Fund, as well as the Government of Canada. So with that, a little bit of housekeeping taken care of. It's my pleasure to introduce today's keynote presenter. Brent Preston and his wife, Gillian Flies, own and operate the New Farm, an organic vegetable operation near Creemore, Ontario. They specialize in cut salads for the wholesale and food service market and provide produce to some of the best restaurants in Canada. Brent is the president of the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario and the director of Farmers for Climate Solutions, a pan-Canadian coalition of farm organizations that advocates for better climate policy and agriculture. He's also the author of The New Farm, or 10 Years on the Front Lines of the Good Food Revolution, a national bestseller. Prior to launching his farming career, Brent worked as a human rights investigator, election observer, and journalist on 4 continents. And today, Brent is with us. Welcome, Brent.
Thanks so much, Stuart. Thanks, everybody. You can hear me okay, Stuart?
Yes, sound great.
Great. Thanks, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. Normally, I think at this time I'd be cruising around the trade show at the Guelph Organic Conference and having some carrot juice from the Fenning stand. I'm looking forward to getting back and seeing everyone in person, hopefully next year. I'm going to share my screen now, if that's okay. I've got a little presentation here. Hold on. There we go. Just give me 1 second. I'm just pulling up my presentation. You can see that okay? Great, fantastic. So as Stuart mentioned, I'm the right now working as the director of Farmers for Climate Solutions. Our sort of full-time director, Karen Ross, who hopefully many of you have interacted with in the past, is on maternity leave. She had a beautiful baby boy in October, so I'm taking over from her for the next year up until October of this year. But I'm a full-time farmer. I've taken a leave of absence from my farm and focusing full-time on working for Farmers for Climate Solutions this year. But today I'm going to talk to you first of all about some of the climate action that we've tried to take on our farm, some of the things we've tried to do to drive down our greenhouse gas emissions and make our farm more resilient over the long term. And then I'm going to talk about the efforts that we've made to spread those kind of practices and get all farmers moving in the right direction through our work with Farmers for Climate Solutions. And I know Stuart and I are going to have a bit of a back and forth, a little dialogue after this presentation, but we'll leave lots of time for questions, comments, interaction with the audience at the end of all of this. So My wife Gillian and I run a farm that we call the New Farm. It's near Creemore, Ontario, so in the South Georgian Bay area, about an hour and a half northwest of Toronto. And we've been farming on that land for 15 years now. We just completed our 15th growing season. I come from a non-farm background. I grew up in suburban Toronto, but Gillian grew up on a farm in Vermont. And we made the transition to farm life when we had two small kids, 15 or 20 years ago, and have been going at it ever since. So we have our farm is 100 acres, but we grow on about 20 acres of land. This is a Google Earth shot of our main production area. And you can see back then when this was taken, there was a lot of bare soil. I'm embarrassed to show this picture sometimes. We farm with a crew of workers who come up from Mexico every year. We have 7 full-time employees during the growing season. And some of these guys have been with us for more than 10 years now. So the 3 guys on the left of the screen, Juan Carlos, Schwen, and Luis, are brothers, and they've been with us for 10 seasons now, and the other guys have been with us for more than 5. We specialize in cut salad production. That's our main business. So we grow salads that we put in bulk bins that we sell to restaurants and to food service companies. And then we also package salads for retail in Southern Ontario. But most of our salad is going in wholesale packages to restaurants. We also do cucumbers. We have 5 unheated high tunnels that we grow cucumbers in during the main growing season. And most of those go to retail. We sell a very, very small amount to food service. It's mostly into retail. We also have a sort of third line of business beyond salad and cucumbers, and that's on-farm events. So about 5 or 6 years ago, we built this on-farm event facility where we can hold small corporate events, fundraisers, lots of different things. And then we also do some big events and big fundraising events on the farm. That's a small revenue stream for us, but it's something that has, I think, a lot of potential for growth. And it's also important sort of for the overall goal of our farm to spread the word about organic and regenerative agriculture. So I'm going to talk, first of all, about what we've done on our farm to try to improve our climate performance. And this is something that has been a focus of our work from the very beginning, from the day we started farming. We wanted to farm in a way that's going to make a positive contribution to climate change. So our thinking of what that means has evolved a lot over the past 15 years, but it's been a priority from the very, very beginning. So the first area that I want to talk about is cover crops. We have a really aggressive cover cropping regime. We grow summer cover crops that are a cocktail crop, so 9 or 10 different species. You can see this is just after germination. So we've got sunflowers, forage peas, oats, barley, tillage radish, facilium, flax, sun hemp. We're always sort of experimenting with things. Every year we talk to our seed supplier at Spear Seeds and say, what could we throw in the mix this year? So that mix has been evolving over the years and getting more complex. So we usually do, what we've done in the past is 1 year in cover crop and then 1 year in vegetables and alternating back and forth. But I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about how we're altering that a little bit. So this is a nice stand of summer cover crop. We found that different weather conditions cause different expressions of the cover crop. So different plants will be dominant, or different species will be dominant depending on the weather conditions, but that with the cocktail like this, there's always stuff that's going to grow really well no matter what conditions we end up getting. We've experimented with terminating the cover crop at different times, at different stages of growth, but you can see this is a really heavy cover crop with that's gone sort of sunflower and sorghum Sudan grass dominant, just based on the weather we had. There's constantly a fight between Gillian and I about when to terminate because she wants to see the sunflowers bloom, but when that happens, we sometimes get oats and things going to seed. So anyway, one of the things you have to work out. That summer cover crop is all winter kill varieties. So this is what we like to see late in the fall, where we have a good heavy cover on the soil and growing this year, growing well into December. Lots of green growth in December. And when we get to that stage, sometimes we get really big tillage radish growth, which is really fun to see, and great to see huge holes and aeration and all sorts of good stuff in the soil from that. We also grow winter cover crop, primarily winter rye, that we seed directly into the salad stubble after the last harvest. So as soon as we have a section of ground where we've harvested and we won't be replanting salad, I used to till and then plant cover crop, but then I realized that it was just an extra tillage event that we didn't really need. And so we plant directly into the salad stubble, and there you can see rye growing up in between beds of harvested salad, and it's also growing in those beds, and those beds of salad greens will winter kill really early, and the rye takes over, and then we get a really nice stand of rye the next spring, which we usually mow before incorporation. And we don't often let it get this big. This is a little bit extreme. So beyond cover cropping, we've also planted a lot of trees on the farm. So we planted over 10,000 trees in hedgerows, in blocks of forest. We're just every year we're finding places where we can plant more trees, and the trees have really contributed to a really noticeable increase in biodiversity. So we see much bigger songbird population than we started. We see lots of reptiles like this milk snake. We get the odd amphibian wandering through the fields. Every year we'll come across a snapping turtle going I don't know where across the salad fields. And we've seen a really noticeable increase in insect diversity. So this was a picture taken early in the morning when I went out into a stand of cover crop and realized that there were bumblebees sleeping on every single sunflower head. But when a cover crop is in bloom, you can stand in that cover crop, close your eyes, and just hear the drone of pollinators. It's really amazing to see the increase in insect diversity we've been able to achieve over the years. One area where we really fell down in environmental and climate performance was tillage. So I think like a lot of organic farmers, we relied really heavily on tillage in the early years of our farm. And especially since we're specializing in salad greens, because this is a stand of harvested mustard. In the mid-season, we're 3 weeks from planting to harvest, and we don't recut our salad greens. We just do a single cut. So we would plant the greens, 3 weeks later harvest them, till. Usually here we are out the back of the tractor with the rototiller turning in a bed of salad greens, and then a week later till it a second time and then replant. On our ground, we usually get 3 or 4 successions of salad plantings per season. So you multiply that by a couple of tillage events in the spring to get rid of the cover crop, 2 tillage events in between each succession. We're sometimes up to 10 or 11 tillage events in a season, and we could see, first of all, we could see the damage it was doing to the soil. The soil over the years became much more fine-grained at the surface. It dried out a lot quicker after tilling. We really became reliant on irrigation to germinate our salad plantings, and very subject to wind erosion. And in our soil tests, even though we're doing this very, very intense cover cropping regime and only growing salad every other year on the ground, our soil organic matter levels were staying more or less flat over a period of about 10 years. We weren't really increasing our soil organic matter year after year. So we, with help from the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario, we signed up to the farmer-led research project, and we trialed using tarps on a large scale to kill salad stubble in between successions instead of tilling. So here you can see these big We started out by using silage tarps, which we then eventually converted to landscape fabric because the silage tarps are horrible to work with. They'd pool water on top. They're incredibly heavy. And if deer walked on them, they'd punch holes in them. So landscape fabric is twice as expensive, but much more durable, much easier to work with, and really key, it lets water through. So we would go from this kind of weedy, stubbly mess after harvest to this in 2 weeks in mid-season underneath the tarps. So you can see it almost completely eliminates all of the residue that was there in a very, very short period of time with no soil disturbance. And so then we go over it very lightly with a tine weeder just to scuffle the surface so we can get a seed in there, and then replant with our 6-row push seeder. So this has been a really effective way to reduce tillage. We've almost been able to completely eliminate in-season tillage in between successions of salad greens, but we didn't anticipate that we'd get much better growth from our subsequent to tilling. So subsequent to tarping, one of the great advantages of the farmer-led research project is it forced us to be very scientific about how we went about the process of trialing these techniques. And so we would trial tarped ground and tilled ground right beside each other. And because there's a very defined line between the two treatments, it was very easy to see the difference in growth in the crops afterwards. So you can see really, really clearly this is the same variety, planted on the same day, same weather conditions, just the stuff on the right had been tilled and the stuff on the left had not. So we found immediate, very, very noticeable advantages to reducing tillage, and we've now had no in-season tillage for the past 2 seasons, and we are seeing much, much better germination rates, much better soil moisture retention. When we have dramatically reduced the amount of irrigation we need to use because now the undisturbed soil is much damper and in most conditions will germinate a crop of salad greens without having to add irrigation to it. So it's cut down labor, also cut down a lot of labor and weeding. So you can see the stuff on the left is already up and over top of any weeds that have germinated, and you can see the weeds in between the rows on the right. So we've saved a lot on labor for weeding. The challenge now is to try to reduce our tillage in our cover crop management. So 3 years ago, we made an agreement with a neighboring farmer to custom graze some cattle. This was the first year we had about 20 cow-calf pairs, and now we've gone to grazing heifers because the calves get under the electric fence and really like salad greens. So we are now using cattle to manage our cover crops whenever possible. So this is the cattle in a summer cover crop. They really, really like it. They go pretty crazy on it. And this is you can see the temporary fence and how they really do a great job of eating and trampling down the summer cover crop. We've now changed our cover crop rotation to be a 2-year cover crop, 2-year vegetable rotation, and we are planting perennial cover crops in those 2 years. So this is also to facilitate the grazing. We've gone to in the spring after when the rye is established in the fall. The following spring we broadcast alfalfa, clover, and orchard grass into that rye. We mow the rye to terminate it, and that perennial mix takes over. We graze it for 2 seasons, and then we terminate that at the end of the 2nd season and plant a winter kill cover crop that'll just get big enough to protect the soil. And then we've actually been able to direct seed salad into that ground the next season without tillage. So it allows us to get onto the ground earlier in the spring. It eliminates almost all the tillage in our system. We think we can get down to 2 or 3 tillage events every 4 years is the goal that we're working toward, and I think we can achieve that. So those are the main sort of climate practices that we've employed on our farm. It's taken 15 years of evolution and experiment and talking to our fellow farmers to come up with a plan that works for us. We think we can get down, like I said, to a few tillage average of less than one tillage event per year in our vegetable production, and we're also then grazing on a big portion of our farm that wasn't being used before. We're starting to practice silvopasture. So some of the areas that we planted in trees 5 or 6 years ago, we're now grazing in those areas. The cattle are grazing in between the trees. We're really feeling like we're sort of honing in on a really good system for salad mix production in a way that minimizes fossil fuel use, maximizes soil carbon sequestration, and maximizes biodiversity on the farm. However, we realized after honing in on this sort of set of practices that worked really well for us, that not a single neighbor was using any of these kind of practices. So the field that you can see at the top of your screen here, it's all green. That's a stand of potatoes across the road from us. That is the people who own that farm don't farm it. They rent it out, often switching farmers every couple of years. And what we see happening on that field across the street is extremely destructive practices. Very, very late season tillage, winter fallow, rotation of corn, soy, and occasionally potatoes, heavy mechanical tillage at lots of times of the year. We're seeing, and then in the wintertime we see, big drifts of brown snow, snow full of soil in the ditches on the neighboring fields, on our field. And we realized, my wife Gillian and I, that all of the practices that we're employing on our farm were going to be pretty much meaningless in the grand scheme of things if we didn't move other farmers in the same direction. And we didn't feel like simply trying to convince other farmers that they should switch to organic was going to be sufficient. So over a number of years, both Gillian and I got involved in the sort of political side of farming and in farm organizations. And I became more involved and joined the board of the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario, and Gillian joined Canadian Organic Growers. And I eventually became president of the board of EFAO. And in conversations with our membership and our board members, we realized that this realization that we had come to on our farm, that personal action or personal responsibility was not going to solve the problems we were facing, was that recognition was being arrived at by a lot of different farmers and a lot of farmers who were concerned about climate change. And so the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario made a strategic decision, included in our strategic plan, that we were going to become involved in policy advocacy. And that decision quickly morphed into a real commitment to Farmers for Climate Solutions. We met with Seed Change, the NFU, Farm Folk, City Folk in BC, Equiterre in Quebec, and Canadian Organic Growers, and all realized that we were interested in achieving the same policy goals and that we would be a lot more effective working in coalition. So from that group of 6 or 7 organizations, almost exactly 2 years ago, we have now grown as Farmers for Climate Solutions to 23 member organizations with a combined membership of more than 20,000 farmers from coast to coast in Canada. And organic organizations are really, really key to the FCS membership. So I've just circled the member organizations that are explicitly organic organizations. And there are also organizations in here that are, if not completely organic, then have a large number of organic members, like CAPE in Quebec and EFAO in Ontario, Holistic Management, lots of different organizations involved, young agrarians who have, organic and regenerative as part of their mandate. So we started out by, I'm just going to go through some of the steps that we've taken as a coalition to try to move the needle on climate action in Canadian agriculture. And the first thing we wanted to do was ensure that the federal government recognized that farmers and ranchers have a role to play. So we lobbied in late 2020 to ask the government to include language about the role of farmers in climate action in the speech from the throne. So the speech from the throne lays out broadly the government's agenda for a session of Parliament. And after talking to the Minister of Agriculture and people in the Prime Minister's office, we got our verbatim language that we had suggested in the speech from the throne. So for the first time ever, the federal government made a formal recognition that we're part of this fight and that farmers are important. We moved on to the minister's mandate letter. So every government minister receives a mandate letter from the Prime Minister's office laying out the high-level priorities that they are to pursue in their job. And the Minister of Agriculture federally had never had the words climate change in their mandate letter. It had never before said anything about tackling emissions or increasing resilience. So once again, we lobbied the minister, people in the ministry, the Prime Minister's office, the Deputy Prime Minister's office, and we got a very, very clear commitment in the minister's mandate letter early last year to tackle climate change and to make that a priority for her ministry. We then turned our attention to the federal budget. The 2021 federal budget. We brought together a task force of experts in greenhouse gas modeling and agricultural policy. We had farmers chairing this task force, and we did a very, very deep dive into the sort of most not most obvious, but most impactful ways that we could start promoting on-farm climate action immediately and start immediately driving down emissions in the Canadian agricultural sector. We did some really groundbreaking research. We compared agri-environmental programming across a bunch of jurisdictions, and this statistic has gotten a ton of mileage, has really, really helped us in our discussions with the government, just showing the massive discrepancy in investment in climate-friendly practices in Canada compared to our main agricultural competitors in the United States and the European Union. We suggested some pathways that we could start curving Canada's agricultural emissions down. Right now they're on a slow increase, and prior to our work, agriculture was the only sector in the Canadian economy that was projected to have higher emissions in 2030 than they did at the start of the decade. We suggested 6 very, very concrete policy proposals with funding levels, expected abatement cost. We really did the scientific research to come up with a very, very well-documented list of priorities for the federal government. And I'm going to go through those quickly one at a time. So the first and one of the most important is improving nitrogen management on Canadian farms. This is somewhere that organic farmers obviously really excel. But synthetic nitrogen is by some estimates, the largest, or right up there with methane emissions from cattle, source of greenhouse gases in Canadian agriculture, and it's increasing the fastest. So we've proposed programming to help farmers reduce the amount of nitrogen they use and reduce the amount of nitrogen they lose to nitrous oxide and other greenhouse gases. The second sort of short-term recommendation was to provide incentives to increase cover cropping. Again, an area with a lot of expertise among organic farmers, but we want to provide incentives for other farmers to expand the practice and to put more land into cover crops. And there's really very good research on the climate impacts of increased cover cropping. And then the third big one was rotational grazing. So providing incentives for farmers to move their cattle more often, to improve their grazing practices, and to improve the health of their pastures. Wetlands and trees are actually the cheapest way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, is to preserve wetlands and trees on farms. Right now, just on the Canadian prairies, Ducks Unlimited estimates that we're losing more than 10,000 hectares of wetland per year on the Canadian prairies from agricultural lands. This recommendation is primarily being funded through Environment and Climate Change Canada rather than Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, but it has been taken up by the government as well. And then powering clean energy on farms. This is more a call for increased research. The technologies to electrify farm equipment and to decarbonize farm activities is not as far along as some of the other areas, but something that requires really important research and development in the short term. And then we suggested a program to recognize and celebrate farmers who were pioneers and champions of climate action. This part of the proposal, unfortunately, was not funded, but all of the other streams that we focused on were funded by the government, not all to exactly the level that we had proposed, but the government committed $270 million of new funding in the last budget to these priorities that we talked about. One thing that I thought was really cool was Canada has to provide what they call a nationally determined contribution that outlines where they're going to find reductions in emissions as part of their commitments under the Paris Climate Accord. And our language was used in the 2021 Canada's NDC and talked about the programs that we had suggested. So improved nitrogen management, cover cropping, and rotational grazing. So it's really fascinating to see how we put forward ideas, we put forward suggested language, we talk to a whole bunch of people in the government, and then sometimes it pops out in these kinds of documents, and you can actually see where your work has had an impact. Now we're focusing on the agricultural policy framework that is coming up. Those of you who don't know, the APF, Agricultural Policy Framework, is the federal provincial framework. It's negotiated every 5 years. The one right now is called the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, so the CAP, which probably many of you have seen cost share programs and things under the CAP. The new Agricultural Policy Framework is being negotiated now between the provinces and the feds, and this is the vast bulk of public money in Canadian agriculture. The next one will start in 2023 and run until 2028. So if we're going to have real climate action to our 2030 Paris goals, then we're going to need to have serious climate action in the next agricultural policy framework. So we lobbied the provincial and federal government prior to the federal provincial ministers meeting that happened in November in Guelph, and they came out with a Guelph statement that included GHG emissions reductions and climate action as the #1 priority for the next APF. These are just the high-level priorities that the ministers have agreed to, but this is what is guiding the negotiations now as they move toward putting together the next agricultural policy framework. So we saw environment and climate all through the document, and again, Farmers for Climate Solutions language in the main recommendations. So quickly, the next steps for Farmers for Climate Solutions, we're engaging in the APF policy-making process with the federal and provincial governments. We have put together two more task forces that mirror our budget task force that I talked about. So we have a business risk management task force that is wrapping up their work now, and then we have an agricultural policy framework task force that is looking at everything else in the APF other than business risk management. And we're going to be identifying a sector-wide target for emissions reduction to 2030, which has never been done before. We're adding up all the emissions reduction possibilities in all the different kinds of, or areas of agriculture, and we're going to propose to the government a target to reduce the sector's overall emissions as part of our 2030 Paris goals. So I'll leave it there, Stuart. That's a sort of overview of what we're doing on our farm and what's happening with Farmers for Climate Solutions. My contact information is here. You can check out the Farmers for Climate Solutions website. You can talk to, I'm sure many of you are members of COG or another organization that is part of the coalition. And just before I wrap up, I just wanted to say that this work with Farmers for Climate Solutions, for me personally, has been some of the most rewarding work I've done in my career, in my life. There is an amazing group of farmers and farm organization staff who are incredibly committed to this work, who are recognize that we have a limited amount of time to sort of change the direction of our sector, and are willing to work really quickly and really aggressively to help the government realize the potential for climate action in agriculture. Yeah, I'll leave it there, and Stuart, we can chat about any aspect that you don't think I covered well, or anything that I missed.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Brent. I was reflecting as you were talking about some of the successes you found, that so often in these conversations, I'm waiting for like the other shoe to drop and the bad news, but yeah, didn't see it, and acknowledging that there's a lot more work to be done on this file. I think it's amazing that the work that's been done and the success that we've had in the timeline. So thanks for relating that. Brent, maybe if you can tilt your webcam up a little bit, just to frame your head into
yeah, sorry, I'm in a very small little booth, and it's a bit awkward in here. Sorry.
No, that looks great. Thanks. So the next part of our program today, we're going to have a little bit of a back and forth between Brent and myself, and then in about 15 or 20 minutes, we'll pivot to taking questions from the attendees in the room, and that'll take us to the end of the session in and around 1:20, 1:25. So Brent, I want to jump in here. I saw the list of FCS member orgs, and as you noted, there are several organic ones in there, but there are also a number of conventional organizations. What do you see as the challenges and opportunities of organic and conventional farmers working in coalition together?
Well, I mean, for me, that's been one of the most rewarding parts of the work, is seeing that collaboration across the organic conventional divide. You know, in my work generally, you know, my observations from my vantage point, whatever those might be worth, I've felt for a while that gulf and that divide between organic and conventional has been growing smaller over the years, from, you know, a period of a lot of hostility and distrust when I first started farming to a lot more recognition that we can learn from each other now. But it's actually been remarkably frictionless in terms of the work within the coalition between more conventional and more organic groups. And I think the reason for that is that we've recognized from early on that we need to get everybody working and moving in the same direction if we're going to be effective. So one thing that I've come to recognize in this work is that I've had the chance to work with conventional farmers who are every bit as committed to climate action and every bit as concerned about the impact of climate change on our sector as the organic farmers I've worked with for years. So I'm you know, working with folks like Ian McCreary and Derek Axton and Tanis Axton in Saskatchewan, who are conventional farmers, they use nitrogen fertilizer, they use pesticides. They are wholly focused on reducing the emissions from their farm and really, really committed to climate action. And I think that I've also realized through this process that there's a lot as organic farmers that we can do better. You know, there are lots of opportunities for organic operators to improve their climate performance. And I think we have to see everybody on a spectrum, from the sort of farmers who don't give a rat's ass about climate change and are following some really destructive practices on their farms, to the most committed organic regenerative farmer on the other end of the spectrum. But everybody on that spectrum can move in the right direction. So that's been the focus of this coalition, is getting everybody moving in the right direction from wherever they're starting from. And I think that this coalition is far stronger because it has a diversity of membership in terms of the organizations than if we were just an organic coalition or if it was just a conventional coalition. This has been our superpower, is being able to bring these groups together and amplify our voice. There's no way that we would have achieved what we've achieved so far if it had been one or the other.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the list of practices that you were recommending to the government, a lot of those practices either seem like they are built into the organic system, either by standard or by principle. And I guess I'm wondering, what do you think is the route towards promoting climate-friendly practices amongst farmers, whether they be organic or conventional? Like, are we advocating for everybody to just transition to organic? Like, where's the spectrum here for you, and how do we find more success in doing that?
Yeah, we certainly as a coalition haven't been advocating for everyone to convert to organic. We've been advocating for the government to recognize that there's a lot of positive climate benefits to transition to organic. And that organic farmers have been some of the pioneers of developing these practices that we're now the government's now promoting across the system. So I think that the path, to answer your question, the path to having more farmers adopt these practices are, first of all, to find ways to incentivize them, to de-risk them. So this is some of the work that we've been doing through the business risk management work that we've been doing, finding ways to, through crop insurance, for example, to reward practices that we know decrease a farmer's climate risk and reduce emissions. So diversifying and lengthening rotations, planting cover crops, improving nitrogen management, all those sorts of things. On our farm, we found that where we were really falling down in terms of climate performance was tillage. And I think that's something that a challenge that a lot of organic farmers face. So I think from the organic side, incentivizing practices or finding ways to help organic farmers reduce the amount of tillage they're using. But there's also important research to be done on a leguminous cover crop that's adding all the nitrogen we need to grow our salad greens is also potentially a source of nitrous oxide. It's not as bad as synthetic fertilizer, but it's still important. So as we become more advanced, we need to start thinking about how can we provide the nitrogen we need through biological processes, but minimizing the amount we're going to lose to volatilization or nitrous oxide that's going to cause climate problems. And then in animal production, animal agriculture, the paths to emissions reduction are not as easy or as clear. So that's something that I think organic and conventional farmers are going to have to work on together, is figuring out those pathways to reduce our methane emissions, because the government's really making that a priority.
Thanks, Brent. For those people who want to ask questions, I just direct you to the Q&A button rather than in the chat. Just it's easier to keep track of your questions. So as much as possible, try to put them in the Q&A rather than in the chat when you want Brent to address them. Brent, I hear an awful lot of rhetoric in the context of trying to reduce greenhouse gases or mitigate the effects of climate change in an agricultural standpoint. I hear a lot of this rhetoric where it's like, we can either try to make money and try to make ends meet, or we can try to deal with the environmental crisis that we're in, but we can't do both. And I wonder what your work with FCS and as a farmer trying to walk that line has to say about that.
Yeah, well, this is something that through my personal experience as a farmer, I have found that in pretty much every circumstance, the things that we've done on our farm to try to improve our environmental performance have in the long run improved our financial performance. When I started farming, I thought that there was going to be a trade-off between our environmental values and our desire to make a profit on the farm. And I found the opposite is true, that they're mutually reinforcing. The research I've learned a lot doing this work for Farmers for Climate Solutions. It's been a remarkable learning opportunity for me. And what is very clear in the scientific literature is that most of these practices we were talking about, whether it's managing your nitrogen use better, or planting cover crops, or increasing the biodiversity on your farm, that these things have private economic benefits over the long term, but that there is usually a period of time between adoption and improved profits where it's costing farmers money. So I think this is where we need to focus, is helping farmers bridge that gap and take on a new practice and maintain it until they start realizing the private economic benefits. So it's very, very clear, for example, with cover cropping, that in most circumstances, it takes 3 to 5 years before you start actually getting positive financial benefits from that practice. So what we've focused on so far is encouraging the government to offer programs to facilitate that transition. But I think there's also, this is something I hear with organic farmers all the time, is that we also need to find ways to reward farmers over the long term, so that the early adopters aren't being penalized by missing out on those incentive opportunities.
And do you have any thoughts about how one does that?
Well, funny you should ask. With the business risk management program or business risk management programs that we're looking at right now, and I know, Stuart, you're involved in that work through the policy working group of Farmers for Climate Solutions. We've been looking at AgroInvest, which is a program that many of the people on this call are probably familiar with. It was a matching contribution program that's set up by the government, where you can contribute a certain up to 1% of your net sales to a savings account that the government then matches that input up to a maximum of $10,000 a year. The idea of that program is that farmers would have that money to use in the event of a rainy day, something goes wrong on the farm, a minor variance in income or something, and they would have that savings account to draw on as sort of self-directed risk management. The reality of the program is that it's free money. There's pretty much no strings attached to it. Once the government matches your contribution, you can take it out and do whatever you want with it. We've had some recent discussions with senior people in the government who said that over the past 2 years, when we've seen COVID, heat dome, Western drought, potato wars, and PEI, that with all of these massive disruptions and shocks that have hit our system, they've seen no change in the use of the AgroInvest accounts. There's been so obviously farmers aren't using it for its intended purpose. So we've suggested that program be beefed up a little bit, give a little boost as incentive for farmers to then have to imply environmental or climate practices on their farm in order to receive that money. So the idea, and this is early stages, we're still talking about it, is that we'd have funding through the agricultural policy framework for the kind of programs that we saw in the last budget to incentivize adoption of new practices. And then AgroInvest could be used as a way to reward the long-term sustaining of those practices on the farm. So it would no longer be free money. You'd need to actually implement some good climate practices on your farm in order to continue receiving that matching grant from the government.
Great. Well, I think we've got maybe time for one more question before we jump into the list of questions from the chat. I wonder whether you could comment on, there's lots of discussion in organic circles and otherwise about regenerative agriculture these days, and certainly, you know, what regenerative means to me and what it means to you and what it means to other people is all has different definitions, and that's perhaps a discussion for a different day. But I wonder, you know, in the context of messaging and the work of Farmers for Climate Solutions, how do you think that regenerative terminology, you know, links in there, and, you know, do we need to be cautious about its use, or how do you feel about that?
I'm super conflicted about regenerative. I mean, I think that there are three reasons why this term has caught on so widely and become, you know, beyond the farming community, has so much interest. The first is because it's just a compelling idea. The whole sort of package of using these practices to continually improve the quality of your soil and your farm is compelling, and to me it's a great way to conceptualize the sort of whole idea of what we're trying to achieve. The second reason that it's been caught on so quickly is because I think that the potential for soil carbon sequestration to solve our climate problems has been greatly exaggerated. And I think that there are, you know, documentaries and YouTube videos that make claims that soil carbon sequestration by itself is going to solve all of our climate problems, is going to absorb all the excess carbon we're emitting from fossil fuel burning. And I think that there's just no science to support that claim. Soil carbon sequestration is incredibly important for a whole bunch of reasons, but it's not a silver bullet. The third reason I think it's been really popular is because there is no definition. So people can sort of apply to it whatever suits their purposes in terms of what it means. And the potential for greenwashing is unlimited. You know, I participated in a panel or in a webinar a couple months ago that McCain, the big food company, put on to talk about their plan, where they've made a public commitment to having all of the land that they source potatoes from in regenerative practices in the next 5 years or something like that. And their definition of what that means is almost meaningless. It's you know, it's so easy to achieve that I think it's purely a PR exercise. So I think that our farm has applied, and we're in the last stages of getting our regenerative organic certification. So we're committed to the ideas of regenerative, but I think that we need to. I think that we've been able to sort of further our agenda as Farmers for Climate Solutions without relying on terms like regenerative, without saying that things have to be organic. We're talking about specific practices, and talking about measurable impacts like reducing emissions. So I think that, to me, that's going to be important going forward, is to avoid labels and jargon and focus on what do we actually want to do, how do we want farmers to change practice, and what are the emissions and resilience impacts of those measures going to be.
Yeah, I think that's really critical. It's about 1 o'clock right now, so I think it's time we switch gears and start taking some questions. There's a fun mix of production-based questions about your farm, Brent, and lots of questions with a bit larger of a scope. So we'll just do our best to work through the questions, as many as we can before we run out of time. So the first question here, Brent, from Paul Wortman. Celebrating all of this amazing work, I also wonder how you folks, including the organizations, have acknowledged the importance of prioritizing Indigenous relationships on this topic. How are you in relationship with organizations such as Indigenous Climate Action, and how do we, predominantly settler-led organizations, systemize those relationships so that we don't keep ignoring and breaking relationships with Indigenous partners? Thank you for your presentation. Thanks, Paul.
That's a great question. So Farmers for Climate Solutions has made equity, diversity, inclusion a priority in all of our work. So, for example, the task force that we're working on right now, looking at the agricultural policy framework, we have one of the members of the task force who is specifically looking at equity and diversity and trying to help us when we're making policy recommendations and suggestions for programs, building into that how we can make those programs as accessible as possible to as diverse audience of farmers as possible. We now have a equity framework that is available on our website that is guiding that work. It was developed with equity deserving farmers, including Indigenous farmers and food producers who came together on a working group to help us develop that framework. And our plan is to make that working group a permanent part of the Farmers for Climate Solutions structure. So we're very early in this work. We have a lot more to do, but we are very conscious of it and want to make it a priority.
Thanks, Brent. Pivoting here, got a question. Can you comment on how greenhouse gas emissions are being calculated, and are they being vetted by third parties?
Sure. So this is a really fraught question. There's a lot. There's a lot of detail that you could go into. There's ongoing work that's being done by government and scientists in academia across Canada on sources and sinks of greenhouse gas emissions on Canadian farms. This all gets rolled up in, and Stuart, you might be even better at answering this question than I am, but it's rolled up into the calculations that under the UN system for determining emissions and sinks at a national level. This is constantly evolving and changing. We run into some weird things like the greenhouse gas emissions from the manufacture of nitrogen fertilizer aren't usually categorized as agricultural emissions. They're categorized as manufacturing emissions. So at Farmers for Climate Solutions, we've taken some of those emissions that are clearly very closely related to primary agricultural production, and we've rolled those into our numbers for the agricultural sector. But those numbers might differ a little bit from the government's numbers because they might categorize things differently. And then there are some things like emissions from nitrogen fertilizer use they're just right now just a straight calculation based on the total tonnage of nitrogen fertilizer that's used in Canada. So some of the programs that we're suggesting to use that nitrogen more efficiently and to minimize emissions from that fertilizer, they won't actually show up as a emissions reduction right now because of the way those emissions are calculated. So it can be really complicated. You can get into the question of, we can do something that we know will reduce emissions, but the Paris Accords not going to give us credit for those emissions reductions just because of the way they calculate them. So do we still focus on that? Because we know, the goal is to reduce emissions, but we also have these more formal goals under international agreements that we have to reach, and do we prioritize the actions that are going to reduce those emissions according to the people who are monitoring them? So it can get tricky.
And in terms of the FCS recommendations and calculations around, like tonnage reductions based on practices, and can you speak at all, maybe as a hot pursuit of that question, how that work was done and how those calculations and recommendations were arrived at?
Sure. So people who are really interested in a deep dive can look on our website, and the budget recommendations report. You can actually there are links on the website to the technical reports that were done by the experts who were part of that task force. So on the website you can see who all the task force members were, and you can see the background work they did that led us to our recommendations. But those calculations of what kind of mitigation impacts we could expect, what sort of adoption level we could expect for a certain level of incentivization, those calculations were all done by our expert task force members. So, for example, Alphonse Weersink and Aaron Delaporte at the University of Guelph, they're agricultural economists, and they do all kinds of work on determining, okay, if we offer a $10 an acre incentive to farmers to plant cover crops, what sort of adoption level could we expect from that? And what if we made it $20 an acre? And they through peer-reviewed research and lots of work they've done on their own, they have ways of determining what we can expect from those kind of expenditures. So that's the short answer of where all those numbers came from.
Thanks, Brent. So let me throw a couple production-oriented questions at you. I'll give you two questions here. One from Shord Visser and one from Tomas Nemo. So Shord asks, how many acres of lettuce are you growing? And Tomas is asking, he notices the large shelter belt of trees on the west edge of your farm near the highway, and he's asking, how has this altered or enhanced the microclimate on the farm?
Yeah, so the number of acres, we have 20 acres of ground that we produce salad in. Normally half of that is in cover crop at any given time, and half of it's in production. So every year we're producing on about 10 acres of salad greens. But like I said, we'll go through 3 or 4 successions on that ground during the growing season. So we're producing somewhere in the neighborhood of 40,000 pounds of cut salads per year on the farm. And then in terms of the shelter belt, so we have a really big shelter, an area of probably 3 or 4 acres of trees, actually more like 5 or 6 acres of trees on the west end of our farm. We have predominantly winds out of the west, but then we have hedgerows that we planted on all the farm boundaries and in between fields, and we're seeing it's taken quite a long time for those trees to get big enough to start seeing an impact on microclimate. But we've started seeing, especially in the wintertime, better snow cover on our fields. You can see the area, like the snow retention is much better in the lee of those shelter belts, and therefore we get less wind erosion in the wintertime. Wintertime wind erosion is really bad on our farm. It's a really windy spot. We have light sandy soil. Even on areas that have decent rye cover crop growth, you can still see dirt in the snow if you get the right or the wrong weather conditions on the farm. So the trees really eliminate that. And I'm seeing from the growth that within the next sort of 5 years, we're going to have like sheltering effect of those trees on all parts of our farm. Right now, there's some areas that aren't really getting much of an effect because they're far enough downwind. But I think within the next few years, we'll be seeing the impact over all of our acreage.
Great. Question here from Ken Lang in the chat. How far are we from having credible ways to measure increases in soil carbon on our farms?
I feel like Ken probably knows the answer to this question better than I do. I think that's a maybe intended to be a softball, but it's not for me. The My gut feeling is that we're pretty far. There I hear lots of things all the time about people who are using AI and algorithms and things, predictive soil mapping, where they can take a small amount of data points and extrapolate it over a big area using GIS information and blah blah blah. Um, I just think the nature of the measurement is it can vary because of so many different factors within a season, between seasons. The amount of moisture, heat units. There's all sorts of things that can have impacts that can make a lot of short-term noise in that measurement. So I'm not all personally all that hopeful about a period of a point in time in the near future where we can easily and cost effectively measure changes in soil carbon or soil organic matter year to year over large swaths of land in a way that would allow us to say pay farmers for that outcome. But I might be wrong on that. I don't know as much about it as people like Ken and others. So I'm not super confident in that prediction, but I feel like there's a lot of overly optimistic views on this topic.
I know that one of the things that the government is really concerned with from a practical standpoint, in trying to incentivize increases or something like that, is trying to set benchmarks is very difficult or impossible because of all those factors you said. So trying to introduce those programs is a tricky problem that I know the wonks in government have a hard time wrapping their heads around.
Yeah.
Another question from the chat here, Brent. Still have plenty of time cruising through these. Is there a role for conservation authorities? The one in our area owns about 400 acres and bids it out to the highest bidder every 4 years, which encourages all the worst types of practices. On the other hand, they also have they have first-rate tree planting programs. Wondering your thoughts on conservation authorities in their role.
Yeah, I mean I know that especially in Ontario, there's a high degree of variability in how engaged conservation authorities are in agricultural land use issues. I know that in some areas the conservation authority is really, really aggressive and effective in helping farmers understand better management practices and implement them on their farms. In some areas, they're kind of absent. I hadn't thought about the issue of CAs renting out farmland, but I think that goes to a bigger question, which is the role of non-farming landowners in this fight. The stat I saw recently was that 40% of Canadian farmland is farmed by someone who's renting it, someone other than the owner, and that proportion is growing year to year. We see it in the area that I farm. There's a ton of weekenders, so the large majority of farmland in our area is farmed by tenant farmers. And I think we have to think about ways to engage landowners in these management decisions as well. And you're absolutely right. Like the idea of 4-year lease terms and renting it out to the highest bidder is a recipe for bad land management practices. So I don't have a lot of answers on how we deal with that, but it's something that I think is going to be increasingly important as we go forward.
There's a question here from Marcy Littman. How do farmers know about, she says, your program to get funding to transition to regenerative ag? I work with farmers and want to inform them about this program, which I would assume she either means the on-farm climate action program or perhaps the living labs with the FAO.
Right. So on-farm climate, the government, in response to our budget recommendations, the government allocated like I said, $270 million to immediate climate action in agriculture. And 200 million of that is flowing through what they're calling the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, which was immediately abbreviated to OFCAF by all the people who had to fill out the applications. The way the government's rolling this out is they've asked for proposals from primarily farming organizations to offer incentive payments to farmers for the three main practices that we recommended: nitrogen management, cover cropping, and improved grazing. So that quite a few of the member organizations of Farmers for Climate Solutions have applied to be implementing partners for that program, and Farmers for Climate Solutions has applied overall as a coalition to implement some of that money. The government has not made a decision on who is actually going to implement it. So until we know what organizations are actually delivering the program, we won't know how you apply or what the criteria are or anything else. But for sure, sometime this year, you're going to be hearing from organizations like Farmers for Climate Solutions or Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association, or any number of others who've applied for this. The successful applicants will be putting out information on how you apply and how you can get an incentive payment in order to implement one of these practices or more than one of these practices on your farm. So Farmers for Climate Solutions will, obviously make this information widely available, whether we're delivering it or not. And it's also going to be linked to our climate-friendly farming training program that we're rolling out right now that I haven't really talked about.
Well, that's perhaps a good segue back to a production-oriented question here. Jason Gray is asking, in terms of cover crop management on your farm, when you terminate your winter rye by mowing and then subsequently transitioning the cover crop to forage alfalfa, clover, orchard grass, etc., how are you minimizing your tillage during that process?
Well, we've actually been able to do that transition with no tillage at all. So we plant the rye in the fall. Early in the spring, we frost seed the perennial mix, so the alfalfa and clover and we use a couple kinds of clover, and orchard grass is what we've tried so far. And it was actually Ken Lang who suggested this mix. So thanks, Ken. We've tried a couple different things. We've actually brought the cattle on to graze that rye when it starts getting close to heading, and we've also mowed it. And usually we have to mow it a couple of times in order to terminate it. But we've actually been able to graze / mow it, and the grazing didn't work all that great. They didn't do a great job of terminating the rye. They left too many plants sort of going. But the mowing was actually enough to kill the rye. Mostly, you get a few that end up heading out, but it's not that big a deal because we're not disturbing that soil for 2 years after they head. So I think most of the rye seed that's set either gets eaten by something or germinates it germinates on the surface, and it's not setting enough seed that we're worried about it becoming a weed in subsequent vegetable crops. So we've been able to do that with no tillage is the short answer.
Next up, a question from Food Share Toronto. I appreciate the attempts to bridge the gap between organic and conventional farmers and to build a broad coalition. Have there been attempts to include some of the larger farmer organizations within Farmers for Climate Solutions, like the UFA or other Big Tent ones?
Yeah, so that's a really, really interesting question. We reached out early on in the process to a lot of different agricultural organizations to gauge their interest in joining. And some of the big sort of so-called established mainstream farm organizations like the OFA or the CFA nationally, or some of the commodity organizations like Ontario Grain Farmers, they were not interested in joining the coalition. However, they've been very interested in maintaining communication and supporting our work. And I think I don't want to speak for any of those organizations. They had different reasons for not wanting to join. But I think some of them, they have a wide diversity of farmers in their membership, and they have certain parts of their membership who are just sort of fundamentally would be opposed to working in coalition with some of the organizations that are in FCS, or working explicitly on climate issues. So these more mainstream organizations, in terms of their leadership, and I think the majority of their members, they recognize that this climate work is essential. That whether they like it or not, it's a priority of the government, and most of them think it should be a priority anyway. But because of the nature of their organization, they don't want to be, or I should say that they are happy for us to be pushing the envelope and for them to come behind and support. So I have a meeting tomorrow with a vice president of the CFA just to talk through our business risk management recommendations. We're always communicating, sharing information, sharing draft reports, getting feedback from them. And they have been very, very supportive. When the Guelph statement came out about the environmental priorities in the next agricultural policy framework, the CFA and the OFA and all those organizations said, absolutely great, this is an important direction to go in. We like the focus on climate action. So there's been no undermining or working at cross purposes, but we've recognized that we're happy to work in parallel rather than having them formally part of the coalition.
Thanks for that, Brent. Have time for just one or two more questions here. Andy Hammermeister asks, the measures you are proposing could also have other benefits beyond reducing greenhouse gas emissions, including biodiversity, air quality, water quality. And he asks, is there any interest in taking a multifunctional approach in measuring impacts, or does that get too complicated?
Absolutely, there's an interest, and sometimes it gets too complicated. So one of the strengths of our coalition has been a really singular focus on climate. So we're really, really focused on emissions and adaptation. And I think we'll continue that, but we absolutely recognize all the co-benefits that come from these practices. And we will continue to emphasize those co-benefits and to point out that they exist and to celebrate them. It's also the co-benefit angle, the additional benefits beyond climate are also really important when we're talking to climate skeptic audiences. So we all know that there are significant portions of our sector, like every group in Canada, where people are skeptical about the science, are sometimes hostile to the idea that we should be focusing on climate action. And with those audiences, we're really focused on the co-benefits, on the other things that are good out of these practices, including the economic benefits. So I think that's an important area to maintain that focus for sure.
And we'll take one last question here, and perhaps it's a good segue to touch on the farmer training program that FCS is introducing. Ken follows up here. Given that the amount of carbon in the atmosphere over 1 acre of your farm is equal to the amount of carbon is equal to the amount of carbon in organic matter from 2 to 3.2% just in the top 6 inches, is it not time to educate farmers in their role in mitigation?
100%, absolutely. And I think that we need to educate farmers about their role in mitigation, not just in terms of carbon sequestration, but also in terms of nitrous oxide emissions and methane emissions, for sure. And so thanks for suggesting the segue, Stuart. Farmers for Climate Solutions is started undertaking a multi-year farmer training program where our goal is to provide training to 10,000 farmers across the country in climate-friendly practices. And that's being rolled out with our Farmers for Climate Solutions member organizations at the provincial level. It's a big project. We have several $1 million in private funding to roll this out over a period of 5 years or 4 years, and part of that is going to be education about what those sources of greenhouse gases are on the farm, and the potential pathways for mitigation. I also wanted to mention that what did I want to mention? I completely lost my train of thought. But also that in our recommendations for the agricultural policy framework, we're also in the early stages of developing recommendations on education programs to help farmers understand their role in this fight, including a recommendation to add a climate module to the environmental farm plan across the country, and to provide incentives for farmers to complete an environmental farm plan, including that climate module, which would really focus on some of the basics of where are the emissions coming from on your farm, and what can you do to reduce those emissions and to increase the amount of carbon you pump into your soil.
Great. Thanks, Brent. Well, I think that maybe makes a good conclusion to the session. Want to just quickly thank Brent and to our sponsors for helping put together this amazing session, sharing your experiences. Our staff at OCO have included a session feedback link in the chat there. Please provide us with your feedback. There's like I said, a link in the chat, and we will also send one by email as a follow-up. This information helps to improve your experience at the Guelph Organic Conference. Our next session for Guelph Organic Conference is entitled Designing Regenerative Field Crop Rotations in Organic Production, which is happening tomorrow from 12 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you want to learn more about organic cover cropping, and I'm sure some things in more depth that we touched on today, please check out that session. And please take advantage of the conference platform feed loop, and make sure to set up your profile, check out the exhibit hall and networking features. In the website networking section under the groups tab, there's a room to set up for those of you who would like to discuss the session content further. That is in the feed loop program that you should have seen in your registration process. With that said, thank you very much, Brent, for being here, and thank you to all of our attendees today for participating and for listening.
Thanks a lot, Stuart, and thanks everybody.
Thanks everybody. Have a great day.